right, welcome everyone. My name is Emily Becker and I work with the Rural Cap Grow program. And we're here today with Sarah Lewis. She's a professor of extension at UAF, and she's going to be giving us a presentation on starting a homemade foods business. This program is brought to you as a collaboration between Rural Cap, which our mission is to improve the lives of low-income Alaskans, and also the Tribes Extension Program, which helps to improve food security and food sovereignty among Alaska's tribes. I'll turn it over to you, Sarah. Welcome.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. Thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm always happy to work with Rural Cap, and I am one of the extension agents throughout Alaska that works with Tribes Extension as well as General Extension. I am home based in Juneau, so I am joining you from sunny Juneau. And I am the Health, Home, and Family Development Agent for Southeast Alaska. So that's everything basically from Cordova to Metlakatla. And I also do some stuff over in Kodiak as well. But this particular topic, food entrepreneurship, is my sort of statewide programming that I do. So I do tend to be the person in Extension who, if you contact us with questions about your homemade food business, they will typically be routed to me, and we will have a Zoom, or we will call, or we will chat, whatever works best. But so my programming covers a broad range, but a lot of things having to do with food, including, as I mentioned, food entrepreneurship, which is what this is about today. The new homemade food rules. So because I want to make sure that people have time for questions, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get right into the presentation. There we go. Yeah, like as Emily said, if you have questions while you're going along, if you would please put them in chat. If there is something that is time sensitive, Emily will holler out and let me know that it's there. Or I will try to pause periodically and see what questions are in chat. And that's kind of how we'll do it. And if they're not really time sensitive, we might get to some of them at the end of the presentation. So I am Sarah Lewis. I'm a UAF professor of extension for the Southeast districts, as I mentioned. So this is a new law and new regulations. And so because of that, I have actually found it helpful, and other folks who like DEC who are presenting about this have found it helpful to kind of give you a framework about that. So the way this came, folks might be familiar with the previous cottage foods exemption, which meant that if you were selling a certain range of products and you were selling only a limited amount and selling them in a certain way, you were exempt from needing to get a permit, like a full food service permit. So this is supplanting that. This is actually going to be taking over. So the homemade food, the statute that I'll talk about in a second, was enacted by the legislature. And where we're at right now is in about the first 6 months of the regulations. So the statutes are enacted by the legislature, but the DEC in this case is the agency that has been directed to create the regulations that follow that statutorial intent, basically. And so, but one thing that I do want to point out is that we're still sort of in that period of regulatory fine tuning. There is a bit of back and forth still between various entities, be that the administration, DEC, people who are giving public information, and also as we get questions from the public, sometimes things are still a little bit in that fine tuning, like I said. And so one of the things that I'm saying is please allow us a little bit of grace in this probably first year or so as we really figure out how to best describe and help folks who are working through this regulation. I mean, for example, even just this week, a new sort of statutory intent was communicated that might result in, or that will result in a few changes, maybe on the website, in the regulations. So we're still in a little bit of movement about it. But this is where we're at, and it's because in last summer, HB 251 was a statute that included lots of different things, but one of the things in it was describing how producers can produce and sell food made at home, or in it could be a non-home kitchen, but one that is not a permitted or inspected kitchen. And like I said, it's replacing the previous cottage foods exemption. So it was passed in July. Regulations were then immediately started the drafting of them. And then in October-ish, they were made public. And then we've really been trying to help people work through those and figure out how to describe them and help people start their food businesses. So what is homemade food? It's a category of food products that logically are produced in homes or, as I mentioned, uninspected kitchens, and they can be sold in Alaska without a permit or without inspection. And that means without inspection of your kitchen, without inspection of the foods, or inspection of your business, you know, and things like that. So homemade foods made in home, and they're not being inspected, formerly called cottage foods. Here are the types of food that are allowed by the homemade food rule. If you were familiar with the previous cottage foods exemption, you will kind of notice this top one up here, non-potentially hazardous foods. That's what was included in the cottage foods exemption. So if you had previously successfully worked under the cottage foods exemption, that is still, acceptable under the new homemade food rules. But the types of food were expanded in the homemade food rule to include some potentially hazardous foods. So, and here's a list of food that contains milk or milk products, contains meat or meat products, poultry or poultry products, reindeer or reindeer meat. Those, and there's a little asterisk behind each of those. Those that you potentially hazardous foods that can be sold through the homemade food rule can include those ingredients, but those ingredients must come from inspected sources. So that means the milk needs to be inspected grade A dairy products. Meat or meat products and poultry, reindeer, those have to be produced under USDA inspection. So they can't, for example, be products that include the meat from your home chickens, or milk that you have from your own sources. They need to be inspected sources for those. Vegetables are different. Vegetables, there really isn't, there is a little bit, but there really isn't an overarching regulatory inspection that's related to vegetables. So you can use your home vegetables. You can use vegetables from someone in the community. You can use store-bought vegetables. You can use wild harvest vegetables, things like that. Those don't need to come from inspected sources. So let me start to describe the two types of food. Non-potentially hazardous foods are foods that don't require time or temperature control to be safe for people to eat. So that means that these are foods that have a low risk of harmful bacterial contamination. So when I talk about bacterial contamination, I'm talking about some of the ones that we hear about on a relatively regular basis when there's an outbreak of something. E. coli, salmonella, listeria. There are others, but those do tend to be some of the biggies that we hear about more regularly. And potentially hazardous foods are foods that will only last a certain amount of time, that will only stay safe for a certain amount of time at like room temperature or even refrigerated, or they must be held at a certain temperature, either a high temperature or a low temperature, to ensure they're safe to eat. And the reason you need to take that care with these products is because there is a risk of harmful bacterial contamination to those foods. And so that's what, and some of those harmful bacterial contamination, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but they are things that actually do make humans sick and can be quite dangerous to humans, especially those who might be in more at-risk categories like the youth, elders, people who have immunity issues, etc. So harmful bacterial contamination is in in the food producing, whether it's restaurants or homemade food, food safety, so much of it has to do with preventing harmful bacterial contamination because they can actually make, a relatively large number of people sick if there is an outbreak. So that is what we're really trying to prevent. And so even some of these homemade food rules are designed to help prevent or at least contain those risks. But a lot of those risks, I'll talk about you as the producer or you as the consumer or you as the market who might be selling these products, you might have to do something to contain those risks as well.
All right, Sarah,
So
quick
again,
questions.
yes, question.
Okay. Going back to the slide with your list of examples of potentially hazardous foods, could you use your own chicken eggs in baked
Ah,
goods?
that's a super good question. Yes, you actually can. Eggs, because they are not, if you have a flock under a certain amount, they are not actually required. You can sell those if you have under a certain number of chickens, I believe, and there's some regulations about that. But yes, you can use your own eggs. But if there's eggs in it, it will be a potentially hazardous food, or it will possibly be a potentially hazardous food. And I'll talk about that. But yes, you can use your own eggs or eggs that you purchase from your community.
And then you mentioned vegetables, but what about berries, fruits, apples?
So that's a good segue. Is there another question? We can put a pin in that one because I'll talk about that in a second.
Okay. Well,
Anything
also
else?
freeze-dried versions of those items.
I'll talk about that. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you for those questions. We'll make sure to look at those on this particular slide here. So non-potentially hazardous foods and potentially hazardous foods are separated, like I said, by the risk associated with bacterial contamination and continuing to harbor that bacteria. So non-potentially hazardous foods are those that are high acid and or low water activity, because high acidity deters bacterial growth. So if you look at this scale over here, 0 is a strong acid. This is a pH scale. 14 is a strong alkali. Pretty much everything we eat is acidic. Very few things bump below that neutral of 7. So pretty much everything we eat is acidic. And pretty much, and because everything that we eat is acidic, and we are concerned with those microorganisms that are going to move into our food and either spoil it or make it dangerous, we separate our food into two categories. High acid foods are those that molds and yeasts can live in, be harbored in, can grow in, etc. Molds and yeasts are not universally harmful to humans. There are folks with sensitivities and allergies, and so it's more like sort of that allergy question. There are some people who need to be aware when there might be molds and yeasts, but they're not universally harmful. So they are spoilage microorganisms. They will make your jam sour. They will mold your baked good if it hasn't already dried up, right? So molds and yeasts are what will be in high acid foods. Low acid foods, which are a 4.6 pH or higher in number, but lower in acidity, that is where bacteria is a risk. So let's talk about what's in these two categories. So most fruits, with a few exceptions, so the exceptions being some of those fruits that we actually think of as being vegetables. So like zucchini, cucumbers, those are technically fruits, but we think of them as vegetables. They actually, with their pH, they behave like vegetables. But most fruits are high acid foods. All of our wild berries that we eat and also store-bought are naturally high acid. So we're just worried about mold and yeast with those. And then there's this second category of naturally high acid foods that is tomatoes. Tomatoes are right there on the sort of the edge of being low acid. So if you are doing something that preserves tomatoes, you typically do want to follow a recipe that makes sure to add some acidity, some lemon juice, some vinegar, something like that to that product if you're going to preserve them. But it's so these are high acid foods are ones that are of lower risk of bacterial contamination. A, the main categories in low acid foods are almost all vegetables. One important vegetable that is actually high acid is rhubarb. But other than that, most of our vegetables are naturally low acid, and all of our animal products, whether that's meat, oil, skin, eggs, milk, and that is land and sea, and both places. So seaweed is a vegetable, as well as fiddleheads are a vegetable. And of course, all the things that we grow in our vegetables that we grow in our gardens are vegetables. And all animal products, whether that's marine or land, are naturally low acid. So therefore have more risk of bacterial contamination. So that's one thing that helps us decide which category our food is going to be in. Another one is the water activity. So water activity is a little bit different than like moisture content. You can actually potentially have what you think of as being a pretty moist product, like a jam or a jelly. You don't think of that as being dry, but it might have a low water activity. Water activity is how available are water molecules for use by microorganisms. So it might be a relatively moist product, but like in a jam or a jelly, those water molecules are bound up, if you will. They're being used by sugars. They've been replaced by acidity, things like that. But then there are the sort of the more logical things that have low water activity, and that's things that have been dehydrated. So what you can see here on this scale is somewhat similar to what I had over here, where there's this certain line where you get concerned about bacteria. Similar kind of thing over here. So the red dots are things that we're familiar with that have been dried or dehydrated. And then you get up to the dried fruit, which we kind of know it's pretty hard to dry those. I'm talking in standard dehydration, not necessarily freeze drying. Some freeze-dried fruit will certainly have a water activity that is lower, but standardly dried fruit, dried berries, and we do kind of know that those can sour. Those can, if they do get slightly rehydrated, they kind of bump up this scale a bit, and they can start to have molds and yeasts grow on them. But then when you get up to dried meat and fish, and I like to make sure to separate truly dried meat and fish from cured and smoked meat and fish. Truly dried meat and fish are those that are kind of like dry beans that you need to rehydrate in some way before they can really be palatable. They're just too dry to be comfortable to eat. Whereas cured meats and smoked meats and fish, we actually do keep a fair bit of moisture in those. Those do have a higher water activity, and that's what makes it so that they're snackable. You don't have to rehydrate them to make them palatable. But that also means that they have a higher water activity. And you can see that the farther you go up this scale, the closer you get to bacteria. And fresh meat and fish are over that line. That's part of the reason we know that, with that low acid meats and fish and the high water activity meat and fish, we refrigerate those, we freeze them, we cook them quickly because we know that they are a bacterial risk. So, generally, things that are below this mold category here would tend to be in the non-potentially hazardous category, and things that are above this 0.8 in general will be in the potentially hazardous category. Now you might say, why would something that might mold be in the potentially hazardous category? Because if your dried meat or fish actually starts to mold, they are likely in air, they are starting to hydrate. And so they relatively quickly can get up into that category of being a bacterial risk because they have meat or fish in them. Um, and and things that are low water activity, what you're worried about is they're going to either go stale, or they might ferment, or they might mold. So those are some of the, so when you're talking about freeze dried, most of that stuff is going to be in this category. But one of the sort of nuances with freeze drying is you can take meats, and other animal products and really dry the heck out of them. And they could be pretty low water activity. They could be very low water activity. But this is one of the responsibilities that you, as a homemade food producer, you would need to ensure, you'd need to figure out whether it's a non-potentially hazardous or potentially hazardous food. The ways that you do that is by doing some testing. So let me give you a couple of examples. A category that I haven't talked about yet over here in the when it comes to acidity is pickles. So vegetables that have been acidified become pickles, and those can be acidified either through a salt fermentation, lactofermentation process, or they could be acidified by using vinegar. So, but if you don't ferment them long enough or correctly, or if you don't add enough vinegar, you could potentially still have a pickled vegetable that perhaps is below this, is still low acid instead of high acid. And so pH tests are what let you know and ensure that you actually have a non-potentially hazardous food. pH tests, if you are someone who is looking at producing pickled vegetables, I highly recommend that you actually purchase your own digital pH meter, because you do want to have the number. You don't necessarily want to use test strips, and you want to use that pH meter anytime you change your formula. So if you change the ingredients, etc. It is also possible to get pH tests from the DEC lab in Anchorage. It does take a while, and there's a cost associated with it. So if you're doing pickles or anything that is acidified, an acidified vegetable, I highly recommend you buy your own. They're between $100 and $200 and can be very worth it to you to have those. Now, water activity is a little bit more difficult. So if you have a product that has animal products in it, eggs, meat, fish. Well, we're not going to, we'll talk about fish when it comes to homemade foods in a second. But if it got animal products in it, you are, and there hasn't been any kind of kill step, like it's not, it might have been a cooked product, but then, if it's got meat and vegetables, which tend to, they might have low acidity, and they might have, vegetable soup is going to have pretty high water activity. You're going to want to get a water activity test to show to yourself, because there are specific reasons why you need to know whether your food is potentially hazardous because maybe it's got a high water activity, or if it's non-potentially hazardous because you have reduced the water activity to be low enough. There are also times when water activity and pH work together. So jams and jellies are a good example of that, because they are fruit, because sometimes they may even have, vinegar in them as flavors, whatever. They've got lots of sugar in them. They tend to be both high acidity and lower water activity, because all of that water is bound up with the sugar and the acids in the product. And so they are both. So sometimes these things will work together, but that's something that you as a food producer is going to need to determine about your products. And the water activity tests are not something you can easily do at home. It's pretty expensive equipment, and like in the thousands of dollars type of equipment, and some specialized knowledge is needed to use them. So at this point, you would need to send those to the DEC lab to get those done. We're trying to create some other possibilities for more local access to water activity tests. DEC is working on trying to get more water activity testers out into, throughout communities, throughout the regions, so that people aren't having to always send it to the state lab. But that's something that's in the works to help you determine whether your food is non-potentially hazardous or potentially hazardous. This might be a good time to stop and see if there's any questions that are kind of time sensitive.
And there's just now a question. Are there any household or harvestable items that can act as a desiccant for dry goods to keep water activity low?
That is a question I've never had before. And so I guess it would really depend on what kind of product you're talking about. So, like for example, the more sugar you add might, decrease the water activity. That's one thing that could happen. Um, when it comes to dehydrated foods, and so what I think maybe you might be talking about is when, like, you have a dehydrated food or a freeze-dried food, you put it into a bag, you put a desiccant in with it to kind of make sure that if any moisture gets in there, it gets contained so it doesn't affect your food. And if any, I am not familiar with anything that you could kind of use from the wild or garden harvest or something that might be in your house that you could use other than those store-bought desiccants. I would actually be interested to see if anybody knows about something like that in the chat, and we can maybe talk about that a little bit later if people have a chance to put that in the chat.
That'd
Any
be
other
great.
questions?
Yeah, so just clarifying if you have experience on desiccants. And then I was saying, Sarah, after I took one of your classes last summer, I invested in a pH meter because I like making like simple syrups out of things like, I think I did a lilac. These are non-tested recipes. So having a pH meter was super helpful. And I think I paid around $40 for mine. And I love it. It's like an awesome kitchen tool. I don't know if you have a recommended one, Sarah.
There used to be some recommended ones on the DEC website. What I tend to recommend to folks is to go to an online or an in-person restaurant supply store, because they actually do some vetting about what are good products. If you go to Amazon, for example, there are just a ton of possibilities of all different price ranges. And if it's something that you really do want to rely on and you don't want it to only, work through four, uses or something like that, getting something that restaurateurs have, sort of time tested and, lab tested, if you will, is a good resource so going through a restaurant supply store is a good way to do it rather than Amazon. Other than that, I don't have any specific ones. You'll need to, when you get a pH meter, you will also have to do some calibrating with it. So it'll actually come with some directions about how to, somewhat regularly calibrate it to make sure that it is actually reading accurately as well. So you need to do a little bit of, read the directions on those things.
All right.
Any other questions?
So another question, can a combination of pH and water activity be used to determine if food is potentially hazardous?
Yes, yes. And so that might be, so as I mentioned, this is a little bit of back and forth right now as we're learning the questions that people have. And so I know that it used to be on the DEC website, they did, I believe, and also we have Cooperative Extension it has been pulled because it's being revised, a publication called starting your gosh, basically about homemade food businesses. I can never remember the whole name because I just call it our homemade food business publication, that actually gives some charts related to that. And so eventually we will again have some of those things available. In the meantime, that's something that you can contact me about and we can figure it out. Or we can start talking with the state lab about that kind of stuff, or talk with DEC, because there are charts that you can look at, but you will have to have those numbers first to kind of figure out where you are at on the charts or what your goals are. So that is something that as we continue get to have information for the public, we'll make sure to have those charts back available. So expiration dates are a weird thing. The really best buy, there are really no dates are you going to find on something that actually tells you that it will go bad on this date. They are for different reasons. There are very few things. There's a couple things that they have expiration dates because the nutritive value may have gone below. So like baby formula, vitamins, medications will have relatively hard dates because they can't guarantee the full effectiveness or the nutritive value of that. But pretty much everything else is advisory. So, for example, if you were to use some milk in a baked good, that technically yesterday was the date because you live in Tennecky Springs and you don't get the milk until 2 days before it's going to expire. But it tastes good, it smells good. That may be the milk that you choose to use in your product. So just as it is with using those dates as advisory for your own eating purposes, however you are, I guess partly most comfortable, but also really using literally your senses to make sure that what you're looking at, whether it has gone bad or not, if that makes sense. So unfortunately, there's no
Gotcha.
hard and fast on those dates.
All right. And then what about the little desiccant packs that you find, you
So
could maybe
some of these are getting pretty detailed. I'm wondering if I
Okay.
could keep going because we're
Yes, I think
past the half mark, and then perhaps we can maybe circle back to some of these things at the end. And I apologize that, yes, I know they're kind of related to this one slide, but shall I keep going and then we can try to come
yes, I
back?
think that's a good idea. And Sarah, are you
Okay.
going to get to the business license requirements about?
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Yep. Yep.
All right,
For sure.
carry on. Thank you.
That's what I want. Awesome. Thanks so much. Okay, so here are types of food that are not allowed by the homemade food rule, meaning none of these either products or ingredients can be included in your products if you want to sell under the homemade food rule. No seafood or shellfish or products that contain them can be sold under the homemade food rule. I'll tell you a little bit why in a second as I go down this list. Controlled substances or food that contain controlled substances, oils, game meat. We have, there's an exception to that sort of. Reindeer really isn't sort of in that category. We might think of it a little bit, but reindeer is actually inspected if it comes through an inspected source here in our state. Milk or milk products, meat or meat products, and this poultry, et cetera. And this can be a little bit confusing to folks because you're like, well, what's a milk product? Well, a milk product is milk, cheese, yogurt. A meat product is ground meat, cured meat, sausage that you have, that doesn't come from an inspected source. And so, yes, you might be making a product that qualifies for the homemade food rule and it has meat in it or it has milk in it, like a cheesecake is a great example. That is a product that has milk in it, but it isn't like the absolute main product like cheese is. So it isn't a cured or fermented milk product like yogurt or cultured milk product. So that can feel a little bit confusing. So if these products, you can't sell milk and you can't sell the milk product, but you can use inspected milk or inspected milk products in your recipes. So that's how that works. Same with all of the other things. And the reason for a lot of these is because many of these things are already covered under specific food manufacturing regulations. So as we know, seafood and shellfish are definitely regulated by other laws and rules when it comes to food in Alaska. Obviously controlled substances, those are under completely different regulations. And it is similar for a lot of these other things because they are regulated by something else that is very specific. They cannot be sold under the homemade food rule. They can, if they are inspected, be products with be in ingredients within your thing, except for the seafood and the shellfish and the controlled substances, none of those at all. And when we're talking about some of these products, also part of the reason they have their own regulations is because they have kind of a kicker, like a food safety kicker, because they are things that is known to harbor more bacteria. And so we need to be more careful with them when it comes to food products that include them. There might be greater public safety risks associated with them. And so they have their own regulations and cannot be included in products that qualify for the homemade food rule.
So quick clarifying
Sure.
question. So if you're using like cheese in the ingredients, like it can't be homemade cheese, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. Requirements for selling. So this is part of the reason why you, as the producer, need to figure out whether you have a non-potentially or a potentially hazardous food, because it changes how you can sell it. So non-potentially hazardous foods, high acidity, low water activity, you can sell those direct to consumer, of course, or you can actually sell those products through an agent. I'm going to talk about that a little bit on a later slide, but you can actually sell through your products through a third party as long as you are both following the rules associated with your homemade food. When it comes to potentially hazardous foods, you can only sell direct to consumer. That's it. You cannot sell through a third party at all. If you sell both potentially hazardous and non-potentially hazardous foods, you need to display those separately from each other. And I mentioned over here, even when you're selling something through an agent, your homemade foods, your foods that are made under the homemade food rule, must be displayed separately from any foods that that agent, and an agent might be a cafe, a market, a food hub. There might be different third parties that people will sell through. Um, and so if they sell other types of food, your homemade foods need to be displayed separately from those. And there are some other both recommended and required things when it comes to selling through an agent. Both types, though, online ordering and payment and advertising and all those things are okay. It's just that the point at which you are selling it to the consumer, whether it's directly or for non-potentially hazardous through an agent, but you can do all kinds of other things online. You can send out emails letting people know that you have a whole bunch of cheesecakes ready to go and would they like to order them, and they can pay for them online, etc. These products can only be sold in Alaska. So you cannot make anything and then head to Washington and sell it down there, or sell it online to another state, etc. And also selling online, at least at this point, like when you're talking about potentially hazardous foods, that may not be considered direct to consumer. When we were doing when the cottage foods exemption happened, some eventually, as people started learning the different markets that they could sell through, some sort of exemption or variances were allowed related to that, but I don't know that that will happen here. So at this point, you really need to be selling direct to consumer only. So when it's a potentially hazardous food, you can do all kinds of things online, but you cannot mail it at this point. And it can only be in Alaska. There's one of the bigger sort of um, really helpful, frankly, things that change is no limit on sales or volume. So you can sell as much as you want and you can make as much money from what you are selling as you want. Now, any of these things that sort of remove restrictions on keeping it a small business are things that you, as the producer, need to recognize, the more people that you are able to serve with your product, the more you really do need to have a food safety mindset to make sure that you are doing everything in a very food safe way, because the more people that buy your product, if you have a batch that something goes wrong with that and starts making people sick, there are potentially more people. So that's where it's good that you have lots more freedom in terms of how much you can make, how much in terms of both product and money, but recognize that you need to be careful about that as well. Um,
Phew, okay,
requirement,
hang on.
go ahead.
Okay.
Was it a question about
So,
selling through an agent? Go ahead.
well, some more questions about, who are agents, but I think we got some answers in the chat on that. So, for one thing, who's enforcing these rules? Are entrepreneurs supposed to self-enforce, or which department is enforcing that?
So at this point, there is a very minimal mechanism by which these rules can be enforced. It really, a lot of the onus of ensuring that the products are safe, or ensuring that you are selling safe products for someone else, or ensuring that you are buying what the potential risks are of what you're buying, are at the public level, not necessarily at an enforcement level. What we have been seeing so far in general is that it has been community enforcement. It has been someone who sees a product being sold in their community that they are concerned about, and reaching out to either the DEC or to me, or I'm not sure necessarily who else. It might be to their own local communities in some way, to say, hey, I think that might be dangerous. I don't think that they should be selling that. So right now, that is actually mostly what's kind of happening. And then also, you've got to remember, on that community level is people reviewing online, so it's word of mouth, etc. So really, at this point, um, unless you do something really obvious at a huge market and you're selling something that is very much not a homemade food, and you're in a community that there might happen to be an inspector that walks by, uh, that's one of the things to recognize. The difference between the cottage foods exemption was those foods were very low risk. So they were going to mold, or they might dry out, or they might get, slightly fermented, and they spoil before they become dangerous. This new law allows potentially hazardous foods, potentially dangerous food products to be sold. And so it really is at the public level at this point.
Okay, and Sarah, just clarifying again, if people are making things like cheese cookies or hamburgers, as long as they're buying inspected foods, like from, you assume obviously from the grocery store, it hopefully has been inspected, that you can include those ingredients in your homemade foods to sell. Is that right?
Yes, if it's coming from an inspected source, if it's an animal product that's coming from an inspected source, non-fish or seafood, yes.
Okay. And then just so we can clarify for people who watch later, like, you cannot send these products out of state,
No,
correct?
no.
Okay,
And that has to do with crossing state lines. That's a state's thing. I mean, and as well as if something makes someone sick, trying to contain it, but that's why states have those
right.
sort of hard lines between states.
Yes, and of course, you cannot sell the products. You can always, send gifts to your friends. Um,
Oh, yes, right.
yeah, sorry. And just looking at the time, don't worry, like, if you have to go, that's fine. We will keep going, and you can always watch the end of this later on YouTube if you have to go. All right, but we will keep on our way.
Okay, awesome. So requirements for selling through an agent. Like I said, this is non-potentially hazardous foods only. And it's a situation where the producer can sell the food to the consumer, or an agent of the producer sells the food to the consumer. Um, like I said, that could be through a cafe, could be the agent that you use, or it could be a grocery store, um, someone who has a booth at the farmer's market, and you are going to sell some of your products at their booth without necessarily being there at the same time, etc. So as long as both the producer and the agent are following all of the homemade food regulations, and I have to tell you, in this short presentation, I can't go through all of them, so I will show you the website and I will tell you to go there for sure. The DEC website is the most important place to go right now. But if both the producer and the agent are following all the homemade food regulations, you can sell. So the terms wholesale, resale, and consignment are, of course, terms we think of in our head, and we might have specific ideas about what that means. Under this regulation, under the homemade foods regulation, um, you can sell in a way that you might think is wholesale, like you're selling a whole bunch of muffins to a cafe who is then going to resell them. Um, or maybe in your arrangement with them, you're selling them by consignment. The way that you sell them is not being regulated, as long as you are, everything else is being done under the homemade foods regulations. So for example, if you were to start trying to sell a product that has fish in it, I'm just going to grab one because that's an obvious one, that has fish in it or has controlled substances in it, you are not under the homemade foods regulations anymore. And so however you sell it, wholesale, resale, or consignment, you have triggered requirements for permits and inspections. If trying to think of, some other examples. So you can sell to someone and they can resell it, and even mark it up, etc. You could sell it to an agent or sell it through an agent and they sell them and give you a consignment amount, or vice versa. One of the main things on this, and I'll talk a little bit about best practices. It actually might be the next slide. Let me see. No. Let me see if there's any questions on this, and there probably will be a fair few on this one. This tends to be a big one. Let me
Well,
know if there's any that are too sensitive.
not quite yet. So can we
Okay.
ask, let me, just to keep our questions in order, where does honey fall in
Oh,
these
honey is
rules?
not honey. If you do nothing to it, if you just gather it, you just get it from your bees, and you don't do anything else to it, that isn't regulated under this, or even really under, I believe it's still the case that it's not really regulated under any other parts of the food code. So honey is like a raw product that, of course, it's important that people understand that there can be, like young children under one, that you need to be careful with honey. But it's as soon as you basically do something to it, meaning you add cinnamon to it to make it spicy honey. Or you do anything that, like, it needs to be done in a kitchen, you sort of adulterate it, if you will, in any way. At that point, it becomes potentially a homemade, qualify for homemade foods, but it is at that point a food, not a sort of a raw product.
Gotcha. And
Yeah.
then very quickly, like, non-edible products, if we're talking about like making soaps or, yeah,
Totally different. Yeah,
okay,
totally different. Not covered under these regulations. Potentially other regulations, but I won't go into those. Yeah.
okay. All right,
And
and then
many of them under very minimal regulations, depending, but yeah,
okay.
different.
And then related to this slide, someone's thinking maybe that some things have changed. Producers can sell through wholesale, resale, or consignment. Crystal, do you
So
want
that's
to?
what I'm trying to,
Oh, okay.
what I'm trying to kind of delineate is those phrases: wholesale, resale, and consignment. On the webs, because there are actual sort of legal, those are actual sort of legal terms, but we also think of them as being kind of general terms. And so that's where the confusion can come in, because on the website, it says you cannot sell through wholesale, resale, or consignment. But then it does, in at least one place, say, but if you're under the homemade food rules, if both parties are following these regulations, it's not really considered wholesale, resale, or consignment. It's just sales. But you have to both be under those. So Crystal, maybe that's something else, and this was something that I just talked, so this is like when I'm talking about the back and forth, this is one that I just had a lot of back and forth with DEC about, because I started going down a rabbit hole on it, sort of really questioning it and what the words meant, etc. And so, yes, it's an area that is confusing, but the way that you sell, whether it is in large batches to someone or selling it to them and they resell it, or you do consignment, as long as you are under the homemade food regulations and you are following all of those rules, you can do those sales methods and they aren't really considered the legal definition that would require permits and inspections.
Phew,
It's a hard one
this
to
is
explain.
tough. Do we
Yeah, it is.
do we have any other questions about the agent stuff before I circle back to some of the other questions about food ingredients?
So let me get through the rest.
Okay.
Maybe we'll zoom through the rest.
Don't
Because
don't
yeah,
feel
we're
like you
on
have to
too many questions.
rush. I
Yeah,
think,
so sorry.
no,
I
no.
know this has a lot of questions. So labeling, those are some of the requirements that you will have to follow, whether you're an agent or whether you're the producer. And this is where I'm going to really refer people to the website. They've got good information about your labeling. There's not very much information that needs to be on that label. So you'll notice that it does not say that you're required to have your ingredients list or anything like that. That might be a good practice, but it's not required. Unpackaged foods, one of the things, so this is things that, wouldn't get a label. Very important with unpackaged foods. Most of the time when you're doing something that's going to have a label on it, it's either going to be something that's frozen or refrigerated or it's shelf stable. Unpackaged foods may or may not be shelf stable or, properly refrigerated, etc. So you need to follow the best food safety practices, because those are some of the foods that are going to be at the most risk for contamination in your kitchen, as you're selling it, etc., or as it's sitting waiting for the consumer to pick it up, things like that. So you do need to, like, and under the labeling, those particular things that if you have a label, but if you don't have a label, it's still your responsibility to inform the buyer about that it's an uninspected product and inform them how they can find you if something goes wrong. And so that might be placards, signage, online statements. Maybe you have an information card or a business card, things like that. But it is your responsibility to inform the buyer about your uninspected food, even if it's unpackaged and doesn't have a label on it. So best practices and risk management. So keeping a product formulation or recipe on file for all of your products. If someone comes back to you and says, hey, your jam was moldy or your pickles were moldy, and maybe they actually start maybe a formal process. If you're able to show your formulation that there really wasn't anything associated that was a risk, then it's just that it's spoiled, and that happens. pH tests, I mentioned those. Water activity tests, that to ensure that if you have a potentially hazardous food, that you are treating it appropriately and selling it appropriately. So drafting a formal agreement with the agent. So this follows along the agent thing. It's not required, but it's highly recommended, because you both need to be following the homemade food regulations for it to be a good working relationship. So there's lots of examples that I could give on that, but you need to have an agreement. And this is the type of thing that you can talk with me about, some of the things that would be important to note in that agreement. Best cleaning and sanitizing practices, I highly recommend, especially if you're going to be selling a potentially hazardous food, look into getting your food protection manager certification. At the very least, get your food handler's card so that you have an idea of some of the most important food safety and public safety risks associated with selling potentially hazardous foods. And if you are selling potentially hazardous food, recognize that you have increased your exposure to getting in trouble. If if you do make a product that makes someone sick or makes uh, results in an outbreak of an illness, and they come back at you, and you're just a homemade food producer doing something in your own home, I mean, you can really see how that could very significantly mess up someone's life, right? And so looking into liability insurance related to protect yourself and your business. Um, and being sure that whenever you have questions about stuff, call me at Extension or DEC Food Safety and Sanitation with questions, especially if you're kind of thinking about maybe, scaling up or switching gears or etc. Um, and then talking about things that are required at local, other than that are sort of outside of the homemade food rule, but are regulations that businesses need to know about. Certain cities and boroughs, military installations, local jurisdictions might have either additional or different requirements. The municipality of Anchorage, I believe currently, it might change. The homemade food rule, I believe, does not yet apply there. They still have their own cottage foods regulations that may change in the future. Business licenses, if there's any kind of licensing that's required at your local level, obviously you need to do that. But if you are a customary and regular business, meaning you are selling on a regular basis, whether it's even if it's over the course of just a season, it is likely that you should be getting a business license to do that business. And if you have sales tax in your area, you may need to register, you will need to register with those folks if this is a customary business, as opposed to, like it's a one-time bake sale or something like that, or a fundraiser. Those are seen a little bit differently. But if you are making money and you're doing it regularly, then you need to get a business license and register for sales tax if that's required. And then boom, this is the most important resource right now, because there is still a little bit of movement with the regulations and some of the requirements. This is the website. Let me go back to, so it's Division of Environmental Health, Food Safety and Sanitation Program. And you go to their homemade food pages. It gives information about how to contact Cooperative Extension, which is basically me. But also, if you have other questions, they have a specific website that you can send that DEC manages, which is terrific. It goes to, there's a page about the different types of food. That means potentially hazardous, non-potentially hazardous, things that aren't allowed, etc. Requirements for selling, that is about how to sell the non-potentially hazardous and potentially hazardous, and it talks about agents, and also it talks about if you are already a permitted food business, and you are going to be selling homemade foods through your permitted food business, there are some specific requirements for you. And then a ton of frequently asked questions, which I imagine are being added to almost daily at this point. So yeah, it's 101. I am happy to stay for the duration to answer questions if needed.
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions.
Should I just go ahead and go to the chat and start looking myself, or would you like to keep hollering them out?
You are welcome to do that also. I mean, I'll give it a shot here. I'm sure I'm gonna miss miss a few things.
Okay,
So let's go back to the ingredients. Oh, and while we're asking this question, someone asked you to go to the slide with the labeling language, please, that
sure,
sample of labeling language.
sure,
Let's
sure.
so anyway, let me circle back to ingredients.
Okay.
So someone wanted to clarify again, like, if they're cooking tacos or cheeseburgers, cooking at a farmer's market with foods that have been purchased at a grocery store, they can do that.
You're gonna have a long pause right now from me. If there is somebody online, because I know that this is actually one of those areas in which there has been some movement in terms of the statutory intent and how it is being turned into the regulations, being interpreted into the regulations. And this has had some recent movement. Is there anyone online with DEC?
Anyone?
So this might be one that if you could note this question, because
Okay,
I do want to get back to people. And what we will potentially do is there might be some answers like this one that we
okay,
send to folks afterwards to
great.
make sure that I'm getting it right.
Okay. And then another question was, so you mentioned like milk products are specifically not allowed. What if you purchased from a grocery store like organic milk and then made it into cheese? Could you sell that product?
Um, I, I note this one as well, but my understanding is no, but as happens a lot when I get questions about this new law, I start like questioning myself
I know.
because right. So at this point, if I would say no, you cannot do that, but I am not 100% positive.
Yeah.
So let's get an answer to that one too.
Okay. So I think that would include
Yeah.
your question, Debbie, about butter. Like, um, if it says
Right.
no milk products, yeah, I don't know. Whew, this is tough. All right.
Right. And the reason is because there's the two different things. There's the food safety issues, and then there's the it's already regulated by someone else issues.
Gotcha.
Right.
Yes.
And so that's where I have the food safety thing in my mind, but DEC has both food safety and how it's regulated by other things, and we can't go against how the regulations work together or separate each other. So that's
Yes.
why, yeah.
There've been a few questions about like what kind of liability insurance or business license questions. My recommendation is the Alaska Small Business
Yeah.
Development Center. They have free, you can sign up for free resources, free advisors, and they
Yes,
have,
and yeah, and we have a small group of folks who are working on this. So we've got someone with Small Business Development Center, DEC, myself, Alaska Food Policy Council, a couple of other organizations that
cool.
are starting to meet regularly to make sure that we hear the questions that are coming in, and so that we're serving people. So insurance is a big one, and marketing assistance is a big one. There's a few topics that are definitely going to be in the Small Business Development Center arena, and they know this. And so right now, what I tell people is to contact whatever insurance company you are already working with for whatever your home, your car, see what they have. You do need to be specific to them that you are doing a home-based food business as opposed to like business use of the home, because there are different assumptions about what those things mean, and you wouldn't want to get insurance that would cover you doing accounting in your home when really what you're doing is food service, so or food products. And so yeah, right now contact your current insurance, but with working with Small Business Development Center, we're going to try to get a list.
Is there a sample agreement for producer and agent?
That's another one that we're going to be working with Small Business Development to create a model for that as well.
Okay. And all right. So freeze-dried apple cider or berries, if it's had all water removed, is it a non-potentially hazardous food?
Well, berries are already a high acid and it's low water activity, so those would be non-potentially hazardous. I believe apple cider would likely fall into that as well, though it's one that sometimes juices are lower acidity than you think they're going to be. So you might want to, get a pH meter if that's a product that you're doing on a regular. But most likely that would be a non-potentially hazardous product as well.
Okay. I've probably missed some questions. Oh, he's talking about fresh squeezed apples. Ooh. Hmm.
Oh, so like, yeah, so again, one of those things that you need to, when you're, a lot of times when you're doing juices and you take them out of their original package, the apple, um, it can sometimes have, like I said, a lower acidity than you think it's going to, just because it's a fruit and is technically it's naturally high acid. When you remove a lot of it and all you are extracting is the liquids, you might lose some of those, some of that, the acidity, etc. So I would recommend any type of juice that you should get a pH meter and see where you end up.
Wow. Yeah, I know it's so fun to go to an orchard and, have the juice squeeze and then just drink
Yeah.
it. And I can definitely
Yep.
see from the food safety perspective that may not be wise. Okay. Can you cook meals from your home kitchen and sell them?
So that is another one, similar to what you mentioned about like cooking up hamburgers at a market or something like that. That is also one that is in an area of uh, re-understanding of the regulation and the statutory intent. So I'm going to answer that one later.
Okay.
Yeah, through an email. So I apologize for that, but
And
that is at this point, yeah. So that's where I'm going to stop, so I don't see something wrong.
Sarah, this is Julie Lekua from Ketchikan. We've had
Hello.
we've had many conversations in the
Yes.
past. So I was looking at this new labeling. So the sign that you have to have, does that supplants the old this product was not made in an inspected kitchen, is that correct?
Yes, yes. So I went to the website here so that I can pull up what they have. Oops. Oh yeah, here we go. So display signage. So under the various sales requirements, either for potentially hazardous foods or non-potentially, they will actually have, I would look at the website because that is, if there are any changes to what is required, that's where you're going to see it at this point. And I'm going to
Okay.
be checking it regularly myself. So you can kind of see their package for individual sale. This food was made in a home kitchen, etc. And then unpackaged food, you have to inform folks somehow the same stuff, non-potential, or so that was potentially hazardous. I believe it's pretty much the same for non-potentially hazardous foods as well. Yeah. So I think
Okay.
that
No
language is
problem.
slightly different than the previous cottage food stuff. Yeah, it's slightly different.